Conservatives have been, for a long time, trying to diagnose the reasons behind the growth of what they see as semi-socialism. This started with the anti-New Deal discourse exemplified by James Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution. They see this as a repudiation of the values of classical liberalism, which stressed self-reliance and entitlement to one's own property. In its most vulgar form, this discourse consists in accusing left liberals of being communist sympathizers and fifth columnists, as Burnham would later state in Suicide of the West. It's hard not to see hyperbole and exaggeration in this. The ability for Western democracies to resist actual communism lies in its appropriation of socialized policies. It is precisely because of left liberalism that our countries have become inoculated in the short term against class revolution. These policies satiate and pacify the radical left, while at the same time easing the miseries of the working class. If these policies have been inspired by anything, it's not communism, but rather the anti-Soviet left and people like John Maynard Keynes. It represents an evolution of liberalism, not in the direction of communism, but rather it has become something sui generis, a society based on mass consumption and pluralism. To discuss this in terms of managerialism is to miss the bigger picture. I would argue that the way members of the Frankfurt School saw the problem as one of the reduction of men to producers and consumers more accurately describes the reasons why the system exists than creeping socialism. Proposals like mass extensions of the welfare state or universal basic income have more to do with a desire to massively increase demand for consumer products than they have anything to do with the accomplishment of communism. These systems are, after all, reliant on the presence of capitalist hyper-surplus. After Liberalism, written by Paul Gottfried, is another one of these conservative attempts to diagnose modern liberalism. He seeks to explore the genealogy behind modern left liberalism, arguing that this kind of liberalism does not have any continuity with classical liberalism, a point of view I will challenge. He further states that modern liberalism is more or less a managerial ideology, following the observations of James Burnham. I disagree with this also, and I will explain why later. Reading Gottfried is part of my quest to find a conservative with a solid set of principles, and we'll see whether my venture has been today successful. In the first chapter of the book, Gottfried seeks to determine what the word liberal signifies. He argues that modern liberalism has little in common with its 19th century variant, which was foundational in the right to property, life, and freedom, as well as bourgeois morality. Bourgeois morality is, to put it simply, the moral norms of productiveness, sobriety, sexual temperance, self-sufficiency, and if not actually, religiosity. Gottfried contrasts the modern liberal position in favor of welfare states or entitlements against the Lockean conception of liberalism based on the defense of one's private property. He is basically asserting that the redistribution of wealth through taxation is a violation of property rights. This conservative objection comes up a lot, but it is never very introspective nor accurate. In the first place, Locke never meant an absolute right to property. He argued that government was justified based on the consent of the governed, and by extension also that taxation was valid so long as it was based on popular consent. If democratically the people decide that they want to live under a welfare state with a progressive income tax, this would in no way violate property rights. The people have essentially consented to a limitation on property rights, so Locke should, in theory, have no problem with this. Now, I also want to point out that this modern phenomenon of support for, let's say, welfare policies, progressive income taxes, what conservatives see as semi-socialism, actually has a high degree of support among businessmen and capitalists. And we can't really explain this as a phenomenon of creeping socialism, but rather we have to acknowledge that there must be some sort of self-interest going on with regard to these programs. And as I've already mentioned, there's kind of a Keynesian dimension to this, where welfare states tend to increase demand and consumption of products. And so in a way, they're kind of expanding the market for their products and expanding the consumer base through welfare policies. So in this way, welfare states and wealth redistribution aren't necessarily anti-bourgeois policies because they can still be in the benefit of the bourgeoisie. I also want to point out that conservatives themselves also do not believe in an absolute right to private property. They support taxation for other programs than entitlements. It's just that they have a particular polemical hatred for welfare, partly because they think it's unsustainable. But to adopt the position of libertarians tactically to oppose a welfare state, while yourself not actually sharing that position for anything else, is a sign of motivated reasoning. Gottfried quotes Hayek and Mises to substantiate his point about liberalism's classical association with the free market. Mises more or less states that modern-day liberalism fails to respect the freedom of the private sector. But is the economy really even private? Today's economies involve public exchange and are often foundational on government frameworks to function, such as central banking or the stock exchange. Modern economies are not private, they are social. They involve all aspects of society, inside and outside of the home. Only in the age of feudalism, where cottage industry was common and there wasn't significant widespread exchange, can we talk about economy being private. In fact, that's what economy meant at that time. It meant the arrangement of things in a family. Today, economy means something completely different and altogether more public. The subsistence economy is dead. We are all interdependent and taking part in a more or less socialized economy due to the evolution of capitalism, whether we like it or not. Since it is public, we have every justification to call for the government to intervene in it, according to the classical principle that public affairs are in the interest of politicians. Gottfried, in this book at least, demonstrates that he is no different from the other scores of conservatives, insofar as he lacks any concrete principles behind his worldview. He seeks to preserve the values and conditions of liberalism from 200 years ago, because this is supposed to be the truest state of liberalism. Not only is this just a form of historiolatry, but the principles of liberalism are very vague and capable of indefinite extension, so we cannot say that classical liberalism is the truest liberalism. If we value negative liberty, then what argument can we give based on this principle to forbid social freedoms like gay marriage or abortion? If we value limited government, then how can we justify the preservation of traditional values? We would have to allow society to evolve by itself rather than to have the state intervene, and in which case, we are more or less just arguing that secularism should become the rule. Conservatives always prevaricate between respecting the separation of church and state and arguing that the state should become a kind of church. If we value fraternity, meant in the sense of a universal brotherhood of man as individuals, then how can we defend borders, nation states, limited citizenship, and racial inequality? If we accept individualism, which implies that it is promoted in some measure, then how can we possibly ensure the existence of discrete social groups or communities? If the state isn't powerful enough to keep out foreigners, then there's no way to have in any respect an ethnos. The reality of principles is that people, over time, will take them to their logical conclusions. To argue that we should halt the extension of principles to just a very small scope is untenable in the long run. That argument is just what I call wagon circling. It's just trying to adopt a notion of progress, such as liberalism, while resisting its consequences. The fact is that you cannot halt the momentum of an idea. Liberalism is already a revolutionary ideology, and the spirit of that revolution did not die out. We are today simply witnessing the revolutionary energy and mentality of that revolution carried out to a further extreme. The French Revolution was a revolution against the nobility on behalf of the economic interests of the bourgeoisie, or third estate. It was, in essence, a class revolution, both in the sense that it was carried out by a class and that it was carried out for class. Why should liberalism shed its skin? The next revolution, when it eventually comes, will itself be a class revolution. Gottfried has already accepted the conditions of the first revolution, and like many revolutionaries, he just wants the new regime to become master again. But revolutions in this modern sense, meaning an upheaval and progressive improvement, abhor masters. Each revolution begins with a desire to overthrow the master, but then, when the revolution instantiates a new power, as it must, there arises yet another desire for overthrow. What we see in managerial liberalism, if it at all exists, is an attempt on behalf of largely the lumpen proletariat, combined with elements of the professional middle class, to put a limit on the power of capital that is antithetical to their livelihoods. The centralization of capital renders the middle class redundant, and it is in the interest of the lumpen proletariat to expropriate their wealth. What appears to be an external influence by Marxism is actually just a culmination of the revolutionary mentality, whose origins lie at the very heart of liberalism. That modern liberalism is associated with social justice and equality is just a predictable consequence of the very fact that liberal systems are based on the principle of equality. But what has happened is that this principle was simply taken to its teleological end, the leveling of all differences. This was partly the original intention behind the principle, to level all differences between ruler and ruled. Why would this not be extended to race, culture, class, and taste? It is because of the possibility of these extensions that Gottfried condemns all interpretation. We see this as a common trait in conservatives in general, particularly in constitutional originalists. They will insist that there is an original, authentic, and authoritative meaning behind every work, and that all extensions or syntheses are invalid because they do not match that original meaning. This tends to lead people on an ironically interpretive quest to discern the original intent behind a given document or book. In the worst cases, this involves conservatives actually believing that there is such a thing as an objective meaning to words. I suspect Gottfried is too intelligent to actually say that, but nonetheless, originalism is his argument against not only juridical activism, but also against interpretations of values he doesn't like. In the context of constitutional originalism, those who hold this view must ask the question whether originalism is itself actually original. The context around the Constitution indicates otherwise because a mechanism was written precisely to allow amendments to it, indicating that the original intent should give way to new formulations as the situation requires. The whole idea of liberal government is a living government, one that is alive with contrasts, contradictions, oppositions, and even the possibility of its self-dissolution. Such an organism cannot but evolve through interpretation. To argue that judicial interpretations, for example, must be constrained by the original context of the document is to have a false picture of liberalism as a static system. This view is common both on the left and the right. To see liberalism as a static idea or to propose a static normative vision of what liberalism ought to be. It leads to the worst kinds of authoritarianism, like Popper's paradox of tolerance, or even the managerialism that Gottfried abhors. In this way, the desire to constrain liberalism by its historical context necessarily leads to the death of freedom. That he cannot see the logical consequences of the extension of the attitude of originalism toward liberalism as a whole indicates he hasn't thought about this question very deeply. He's engaged mostly in a polemic against his opponents who are interpreting the Constitution to their advantage. One can easily imagine that if conservatives themselves decided to make self-favorable interpretations, this would be more positive for them than originalism. As far as the meaning of liberalism, Gottfried refuses to answer. He says that it is a dynamic terminology, as liberalism has evolved differences from place to place and time to time. But I think that the reason he can't find a foundational definition of liberalism is because he is thinking in terms of contingencies rather than principles. Both classical liberalism and modern left liberalism share the principles of liberty, equality, freedom, and fraternity. They just locate, distribute, and extend these principles to varying degrees. The reactionary view of liberalism is thus the more accurate picture. What we are looking at is a continually evolving revolution based on the inversion of traditional modes of political and economic organization, if not the actual inversion of tradition itself. We don't have to go very far to hear liberals, including Gottfried, proclaiming that liberalism is a blessing and that its principles are sacred. The principles of that revolution are one with the revolution itself. Alexis de Tocqueville in The Ancien Regime and the Revolution noted how fanatically people adhered to liberal principles during the revolution, almost as if they were sacred values. He noted the outsized influence intellectuals had on that revolution. It is by viewing movements in the teleology of their principles that we arrive at the most accurate and useful definitions. Liberalism, then, is the revolutionary movement of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which encompasses all the variations on these themes which accord more or less the same with these principles. In the next chapter, Liberalism versus Democracy, Gottfried discusses Panagiotis Condoleez's concept of mass democracy, and then later contrasts anti-democratic liberal thinkers to modern democratists. Condoleezza observed that a transformation had taken place in liberalism, which is latent in its principles, away from communitarian civil obligation toward hedonism and self-actualization governed by a bureaucracy. This move was prefigured by the individualistic and egalitarian nature of liberal principles. He argues that the primary catalyst for mass democracy was the rise of mass production in capitalist industry. Before mass production, people had to reckon with the problems of scarcity, and as such, they could not conceive of consumption or self-actualization as modes of life. This is why the Roman Republic and Greek democracies did not devolve into mass democracy, but instead had restricted franchises associated with particular groups. The advent of capitalism in the 19th century began to transform democratic views. People, now having access to large amounts of goods and not suffering from an immediate problem of scarcity, started questioning the economic hierarchies in society. They started demanding equality in wealth for the sake of an equal economy of pleasures. We also saw the gradual accomplishment of universal suffrage as economies were less localized. Condoleezza's theory is interesting and in some places quite accurate, but I don't think that it in and of itself is a sufficient explanation for the evolution of liberalism. For example, it cannot fully explain why, despite the relatively primitive conditions of capitalism at the turn of the 18th century, especially in America, that country was already throwing off its land restrictions of enfranchisement. What I think actually happened is simply that people began to apply more extensively the principle of political equality and self-government. Government by a small elite of men, the bourgeoisie, is not self-government. It's bourgeois government. The working classes realized this and began demanding political enfranchisement, which politicians like Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson took advantage of. In a way, this is an example of the high and the low versus the middle, based on both principle and self-interest. As far as mass democracy is concerned, I don't believe it is reducible to an even economy of pleasures. It is true that for many men, the pleasure principle takes priority over anything else, but people also have a certain moral sense of justice and fairness. The lack of proportionality between the intensity of one's work and one's pay cannot but motivate one to desire the wealth of his managers. It is still a common complaint today that wages are too low and that work is too hard, and that the working class cannot afford to make a minimal living off of their work. This must be a more important factor in the democratic transformation than the pleasure principle. We can see in the early labor movement and in unionization, as well as the success of socialists prior to and after World War I, that labor considerations played a crucial role in changing people's paradigm of liberalism. If we skip forward in time and look at one of the major foundational works of the modern liberal worldview, we can see in John Rawls that notions of fairness and justice have more animating potential than pleasure alone. The idea of an even economy of pleasure itself involves some idea of fairness. Is it fair for the rich to enjoy pleasure while the poor must practice temperance and frugality? At the heart of this problem is still an issue of fairness, and increasingly people are wont to view inequality and hierarchy itself to be intrinsically unfair. What we are looking at is not so much a desire by lesser men to fulfill their appetites as some classical critics of democracy have suggested. Rather, we are looking at a revolution in the notion of justice in general brought on by individualism and secularism. As I've said before in this channel, and as Alain de Benoit has pointed out, the traditional concept of justice was sum cuique, or to each according to his qualities. It was a form of distributive justice. Instead of this, modern justice consists in universalizing goods and duties, since individuals cannot be different from each other. If all people are the same, then sum cuique cannot make any sense. There's thus no reason at all to have hierarchies. They end up appearing unjust once the root idea behind them, the inequality of qualities, is discarded. We must also briefly note the role of the professional middle class in the election of managerial politicians. There are a number of factors that might drive this, but as one sociologist noted, it might be mainly due to elite overproduction and the dissatisfaction of jobless college graduates. It's probable that they vote for leftist parties mainly to attempt to secure themselves in the bureaucracy or in colleges, which might be extended due to proposals for free access to colleges. We can't say that the middle class is really wanting in pleasures, so I don't think that that is a sufficient explanation for this phenomenon. We might even question the phenomenon itself. What Condoleezza and Gottfried see as a managerial liberalism is hardly managerial at all, even if it may be bureaucratic. James Burnham, in The Managerial Revolution, defined managerialism as the divorce between ownership and distribution of goods. Do we see this occurring in modern liberalism? It's true that there are a lot of administrative regulations and that there is a welfare state, but these regulations do not constitute managerial control over the economy. Producers still own and distribute their own products for the most part. The direct control the government exercised over the economy under the New Deal has been peeled back, partly because most of the program was declared unconstitutional. What exists in the wake of the New Deal is just a mixed market economy where private ownership is the rule. Gottfried even admits this in his work, Fascism, the Career of a Concept, mostly to illustrate how little modern liberalism resembles fascism, the latter of which Burnham considered to be a managerial ideology. It appears that in the present book, Gottfried needs to exaggerate the extent of the American bureaucracy to create the impression that we are on the cusp of what he calls in Burnhamian style a post-bourgeois age. As far as the welfare state is concerned, it is actually not as extensive as in European countries, particularly Scandinavia. It is bureaucratic, but it doesn't constitute a mass program of wealth redistribution of the kind that might exist in a genuinely managerial society. Most of the wealth taken from progressive income taxation actually goes to various other administrative projects. This is because its goal is not to redistribute wealth to the lower classes, but rather simply to serve as social insurance or a social safety net. Most of the politicians who advocate for managerialist policies like Bernie Sanders are actually very marginal in politics. They can sometimes win a lot of popular support, but the parties do not allow them to run. There is an elite consensus on neoliberal economic policies, not managerial ones. To put it shortly, I think Burnham's thesis is, in the short term as it pertains to liberal democracies, wrong. Since most of this book is based on Burnham, it's wrong as well. Gottfried then writes a bit about Pareto versus the Democritus of his time. He believes more or less that societies ruled by the masses would degenerate into socialism because the masses are inclined toward governments that expropriate wealth. For this reason, Pareto believed that franchise must be restricted to an elite because they alone have an interest in safeguarding society's structures as well as the requisite knowledge to understand and to navigate political problems. Even John Stuart Mill had criticized democracy as a system founded on the logic of numbers. These liberal critics of democracy were unanimous in declaring that democracy is simply mob rule and that the mob is always unwise. I must admit that there is some truth in this. The lower classes tend to be more econocentric and proletarian than what used to be more or less a nobility in the past. But today, even the so-called elite are econocentric. The choice being made here by these liberals is between a Republican bourgeois society, whose only moral dimension is productivity, and a democratic proletarian society, whose only moral dimension is also productivity. In either case, none of the values that should properly be called traditional are represented. Gottfried, in citing this bourgeois argument, exposes that he really does not care about tradition. He only cares about traditions, which might more or less just be called customs. He actually associates respect for tradition with the postmodern right, by which he means the nouvelle droit. I've already elaborated on this difference in my video in The Suicide of the West, so I will not belabor this point further, other than to point out that this is a common feature of conservatives. I simply want to note that bourgeois values, since they are so centered around economic excess, are not in any way traditional. It is, in fact, the left liberals who, to some extent, are better grasping toward a classical approach to the economy than the conservatives. In Book 2 of Aristotle's Politics, he writes that a household having more than it needs is an injustice because excess is motivated by greed. We can extrapolate that greed tends to violate virtues such as honesty and love because it simply instrumentalizes people as sources of money and incentivizes a person to lie or to exploit in order to increase his wealth. In other words, it is a purely egotistic trait which precludes also friendship. For this reason, the idea of limiting the amount of wealth a capitalist can have in society by expropriating some percentage of it through taxation is perfectly consistent with the classical and traditional attitude. A capitalist should not have more than he needs to live. We can readily admit that the needs of a capitalist are probably higher than for other people, as he must be itinerant and have sufficient capital to mitigate risk and make investments. But we can still easily question why a man who has $10 million, but whose expenses only add up to about $1 million, needs the whole $10 million. Aristotle knew that politics was a collective affair based around the common good. In contrast, the bourgeois liberalism of the past did not know the common good whatsoever. What Gottfried criticizes as the growth of a socialistic attitude towards society is actually just the atavistic return of a traditional principle, but in a new and vulgar form. When John Dewey speaks of society as a social community with a common interest, he's speaking in terms that would not have been foreign to a Greek or to a Roman. These words are only foreign to a conservative because he, although he will protest, adheres to modernism far more stringently than his opponents. One can only note the fact that Marx and Engels were inspired by the ancient custom among the Germans, Slavs, and Celts of holding lands in common. Socialism, although modernist, has historical antecedents, and in some ways it resembles institutions of the past more than conservatives would like to admit. On the other hand, classical liberalism, although it makes pretensions to ideas from the classical age, really deviates from that age, as Alain de Benoit has shown in The Problem of Democracy. We must also ask the question whether the accumulation of wealth is compatible with those self-professed values of the bourgeoisie. If it is good to practice moderation and self-control, then why is it good to seek the constant accumulation of money beyond what one needs? Bourgeois values are, at their heart, contradictory. It simply becomes an ascesis of money. Every bourgeois moral value is centered around money. We can see this in the continued popularity of prosperity gospel in the United States, where possession of wealth is considered a divine blessing. Somehow, even Christianity has been corrupted by the bourgeoisie. In the next chapter, Gottfried discusses the rise of administrative power in the state. The primary hinge of this motion is FDR's New Deal, which intervened heavily in the economy through setting up administrative boards like the National Recovery Administration, which fixed prices and disposed of excess agricultural products. It also established Social Security. Gottfried is relatively restrained in his analysis, as he does not give his own objections to the administrative state. He is content to quote a libertarian stating that all freedoms are tied together, meaning that social liberty goes together with economic liberty. It is not obvious why this is the case, since social liberties can easily coexist with market intervention. The progressive left has demonstrated that social liberation has at least as much in common with socialism as it might with the free market. It might also be said that capitalism is not necessarily economic liberty. Liberty in the negative sense is almost meaningless. It can be used to ratify any kind of authoritarianism as long as it occurs emergently. Negative liberty is what spawned feudalism, for example, since there is no law or government under which warlords had to comply. They could simply wage war and conquer as they wished, setting up the first kingdoms. Under laissez-faire capitalism specifically, negative liberty more or less grants corporations the right to monopolize resources and businesses. There's almost no comparative advantage a small proprietor has against economies of scale and monopolies. If a discussion on economic freedom is to be productive, we have to assert that the only economic freedom that counts is the freedom to actually do something in the market, like operating a business. Distributists argue that the government should intervene on the principle of subsidiarity applied to the economy. In other words, economic and political authority should be afforded to local persons unless it becomes absolutely necessary for the state to intervene. They then propose that capital should be redistributed to persons so they can set up local businesses, thus ensuring both community and positive market freedom. To declare that free markets mean free people is basically just to excuse the amount of authority that companies hold over workers and against the entry of competitors. They determine whether you eat or starve, and if you do not comply with their dress codes and rules of social conduct and reputation, you'll be left out on the streets. It is a fundamentally coercive relationship, which is only quote-unquote consensual in the most theoretical way possible. We also have to note the monopoly power that companies hold as well as their stranglehold and market share. If this is freedom and independence, then there is no difference between a free man and a slave. Clearly, if we can imagine distributism as a kind of combination of social freedom and economic interventionism, then the libertarians are just wrong about all freedoms being tied together. Gottfried points out a few contradictions in the managerial point of view, which are valid. In the first place, social planners argue for both self-government and minimal government, but then imply that through their programs that the government should be so powerful that it can control every aspect of private life while surveilling each individual. He says that social planning is contingent upon a conceit of scientific authority, but that these planners often ignore or reject countervailing evidence in their beliefs about human nature. Then, in the next chapter, which is quite good, he criticizes the pluralism that goes together with social planning. Modern liberals believe in a society of equal individuals, which is completely inclusive, and into which anyone of any quality can be inducted. This leads them to adopting the policy of open borders, which destabilizes the communities they claim to support and puts unsustainable strain on the welfare system. The motion of managerial society away from democratic self-rule is evinced by the tendency of managers to ignore or bypass popular sentiment. This occurs mainly with immigration, since the public tends to exhibit majority opposition against mass immigration, but elites continue the process anyway. Gottfried also takes on the favorite conservative subject, which is judicial activism, although we can easily say that this is just a skill issue on the part of conservatives. Surely Gottfried would not be complaining about judicial activism if the judges were conservatives. He then takes aim at the therapeutic aspect of managerial liberalism. He notes how, from Adorno's authoritarian personality onward, there has been an increasing attempt to psychologize and medicalize politics to such an extent that liberals no longer confront the arguments of their opponents. Instead, they simply dismiss their opinions as evidence of psychological imbalance. This was more or less what Richard Hofstadter did in The Paranoid Style in American Politics, in which he accused opponents of the liberal status quo of suffering from paranoia against conspiracies such as the anti-communism of Joseph McCarthy. This would set a general trend of politicians increasingly cracking down on political expression because they feared it would produce fascism. Finally, Gottfried criticizes modern liberal relativism. He states that relativism is generally used to dissolve traditional beliefs for the sake of the predominant ideology. This is obvious enough, but he further states something that Thomas Sowell says as well, which is that it basically just results in the endless clashing of value premises. No one of these value premises can be judged to be more true than another, and so intellectuals are caught endlessly litigating them. It's true that there's no definitive way to justify the hegemony of any one idea if we're stuck in the lens of relativity, but this remains true for customary ideas, so-called traditional. An idea cannot be more or less true simply because it is older than another idea. What Gottfried desperately is seeking for is a higher grounding for his beliefs, but since he has adopted more or less what constitutes secular values, he cannot self-justify his conservative preferences. He is forced to settle for secularized customs as a form of false tradition. This is a fundamental contradiction common to all liberal conservatism. If liberalism were a traditional idea, then it would have manifested sooner than 1776. In the final chapter, he gives a short overview of rising populist movements around the world, like the French Front National or Lega Nord in Italy. Amusingly, he mentions Alain de Benoit, with whom he has had correspondence. As for what Gottfried thinks is best, he believes that a stripped-down populism that ignores cultural issues and focuses instead on immigration and free market economics would be the most successful into the future of managerial liberalism. He notes how populist movements have always had more success in countries where there is greater administrative management. He was right that populism would become more successful, but as far as this goes, I have to note that populism always ends the same way as in all democratic movements, with compromise and disappointment. This has been the case with Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has failed to stop mass immigration, as well as with Giorgia Meloni, who has recently approved boatloads of immigrants despite having campaigned on immigration issues. Gottfried, a committed liberal, puts far too much stock in the legitimacy of the democratic system. How populism ends up is in the appropriation of mass discontent by self-interested and obsequious politicians. Overall, I can't say that this was a particularly enlightening book. In some ways, it's similar to Christopher Lash's The True and Only Heaven, insofar as it seeks to find a genealogy from progressive politics, only this time it is without a comparative genealogy of populism. But we really can't know how continuous or discontinuous any movement is, because we can't peer into the minds of these politicians and see where they have adopted their positions from. It's my belief that politics and ideas are generally very discontinuous because people have independently invented the same ideas over and over again, occasionally completely on their own. The similarity of the views of these progressive thinkers indicates to me that not only are they drawing from each other, but rather that they are all tuned into a common pool of presentiments and causes. If these authors were influencing each other, they would not so often restate the same basic premises as if they were original. Instead, we should see a conversation, but instead of a conversation, we just get constant overlap and repetition. Sometimes the zeitgeist itself has the role of informing people's views, and so in such a way, even if the zeitgeist more or less may have been started by a particular set of intellectuals, the connection between today's adherents and yesterday's formulators has become severed and exists only implicitly. It may be useful as a tool for forming counter-arguments, as one could attack these ideas and systems at their ideological root, but that is the task that Gottfried has mostly shied away from. This book really doesn't have that many arguments, and what I look for most of all in a good political writer is an acute sense of criticism. But what is most apparent to me is that, rather than starting with arguments and values, Gottfried simply relies on a valorization of temporicity itself. It's as if he wants to make a period of time eternal. He does say that he doesn't think it's possible to bring back bourgeois society, but he certainly acts as if it were his desire. We are thus still a long way away from sensing whether conservatives really have any principles at all.